アメリカから発信しています。先ほど3時間前に発信された CNN のニュースをお知らせします。バイバイ偽大統領がイランを爆撃したそうです。バイ偽大統領イランを爆撃 CNN からの情報です。昨日、FDR のシステムがクラッシュしましたよね。金に裏付けされた金融システムが稼働しだしたという情報も出てきてます。なんかきな臭いですね。真偽のほどはいかに。トラさん久しぶりの公のスピーチが日曜日2の28の21に予定されてます。なんか起こりそうです。
Were Iranian-backed Iraqi militia based in eastern Syria, just across the Iraqi border, which, according to the Pentagon, were behind at least 3 separate attacks on U.S. assets in Iraq. The most recent was last week, when a coalition base at the Erbil airport came under rocket and mortar fire. A civilian contractor was killed, 5 Americans hurt. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin offered few details as to what precisely was hit by these U.S. airstrikes.
We're confident in the target that we went after. We know what we hit. And we're confident that that target was being used by the same Shia militia that conducted the strikes.
For more details, here's CNN's Oren Lieberman reporting in from the Pentagon.
The airstrike against the site in eastern Syria along the Iraq-Syria border is the first known military action under President Joe Biden. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said it was his recommendation and that Biden gave the final authorization for the strikes on Thursday morning. A U.S. official familiar with the strikes said up to a handful of militants were killed in that airstrike. And they come after a series of rocket attacks against U.S. and coalition forces operating in Iraq. First in Erbil about a week and a half ago, then in Balad Air Force Base just north of the city of Baghdad, and then the Green Zone in Baghdad itself. Austin said that part of the messaging here, and Pentagon spokesman John Kirby backed this up, was first that there will be a response to these rocket attacks, and second, to deter future rocket attacks. Austin made it clear that they're confident that it was Iranian-backed Shia militias that were operating in these sites that were struck by the U.S. Air Force, and it was those same militias responsible for the rocket attacks. Up until now, the U.S. hadn't attributed the rocket attacks to anyone, but now pinpointing it on Iranian-backed Shia militias and more broadly holding Iran responsible for the actions of its proxies in Syria and in Iraq. This comes at a crucial time for the Biden administration when it comes to Iran, as it tries to figure out what to do and how to work diplomatically about Iran's nuclear program, also signaling that it wants to broaden out the agreement to include Iran's ballistic missiles and Iran's actions in the region. Oren Lieberman, CNN at the Pentagon.
Live now to CNN senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann, who is in Erbil, Iraq, the site of one of those rocket attacks earlier this month. Ben, what do we know about these Iranian-backed Shia militia groups, which were the targets of these U.S. airstrikes?
Well, we do know, for instance, that the 15th of February strike, a missile strike on the Erbil airport and residential areas of the city was claimed by a group that calls itself the Guardians of Blood. Until now, largely unknown, but it's believed that this and many other Iranian-backed militias that operate in many parts of Iraq, in northern Iraq as well, since the defeat of ISIS, have been held responsible, in some cases actually claimed responsibility for missile or mortar attacks, for instance, on the Green Zone in Baghdad, where the U.S. Embassy is located, and that many of these are acting in close coordination with some aspect, some part of the Iranian government, the military, or the Revolutionary Guard. But the direct strands are rather difficult to nail down. It's important to keep in mind that, at this time when the U.S. and Iran are starting to talk about the possibility of reviving American involvement in the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, there are various factions in Iran, some of which do want to see a resumption of diplomatic contacts with the United States. And there are other hardliners who are not at all enthusiastic about that and perhaps are instructing their affiliated militias here in Iraq to conduct limited occasional attacks on U.S. facilities like we saw on the 15th of February here in Erbil, like we've seen many times outside the Green Zone in Baghdad. So this is really part of a much broader sort of conflict or tensions that are being played out so also often in Iraq, despite the wishes of many Iraqis that all of these outside players would simply go away and leave them alone. John?
So, Ben, the airstrike was carried out or targeted these Iraqi militias and their buildings on the Syrian side of the Iraqi border. There's also the report that on Tuesday, according to the White House readout, President Biden spoke with the Iraqi Prime Minister. They discussed the recent rocket attacks like the one in Erbil, said something needed to be done. Those responsible needed to account for that. So is there, clearly the assumption there is that within Iraq, this action taken by the United States would be welcome?
By and large, of course, it depends who you talk to, but certainly the Kurds in this part of Iraq and those officials who are sympathetic to the United States do welcome this as a signal, but not too strong a signal, to these Iranian-backed militias that they should not do what they did here in Erbil. They should not fire missiles or mortars at the Green Zone in Baghdad. But as I said before, we have to keep in mind that there's a much broader context to these attacks. And in a sense, Iraq is just sort of the board upon which these chess pieces are moved. And at the end of the day, they are, in a sense, an audience to a conflict that's happening in their backyard, but don't really have much to say at the end of the day. John?
Yeah, it has been that way for a while. Ben, thank you. Senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann, live in Erbil. And to London now, CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson has been standing by. So Nick, just to pick up the conversation where Ben left off with regards to the fact that this proportionate airstrike, as the Pentagon says, was basically intended to reduce tensions in the region. And of course, the backdrop for that is the ongoing negotiations or potential negotiations between Washington and Tehran over the nuclear deal. How do all these parts fit together?
President Biden is in a position in the United States where he needs to show that he can be strong on Iran and not weak on Iran. And Iran right now, essentially, the United States has put an offer on the table that it will come into the talks with Iran before Iran scales back all the steps that it's taken that have gone over the bounds of that internationally agreed nuclear deal. The United States will come back to the table and talk to Iran about the way forward before Iran actually reverses any of those. So there's a potential here for Biden to look weak on Iran, and by these strikes, he's making it very clear to Iran. His patience is limited. There's a real concern that Iran is going to misplay its hand. It has an opportunity to get back into these talks. So that sends a very clear signal there. And I think as well, when we look at the fact that that President Biden spoke yesterday with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, and Iran was a central part of that conversation, remembering that President Trump had been very anti-Iran, and that was something that the Saudis liked. The conversation that's been reported by both sides between Biden and King Salman is one that specifically calls Iran a destabilizing influence in the region, that it attacks, or its proxies attack Saudi Arabia, and the United States would stand beside and support Saudi Arabia in its defense. And also there was a commitment that to Saudi Arabia from Biden, according to the Saudis, that Iran would not get nuclear weapons. So that messaging there has been very strong to this important regional ally, and as well to the Iranians and domestically. I think that's the broad picture, if you will.
Pick up on that conversation that Biden had with the Saudi king. It's notable that Biden has not had a conversation with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. This is a real reset of relations, if not between Riyadh and Washington, but between the leader of the United States and the Crown Prince because of the change, obviously, in the administration. But what is notable is that things are about to get a lot more tense, I would imagine, with the release of a U.S. intelligence report into the brutal killing of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and essentially the big focus back on MBS.
Yeah, it's a recalibration, isn't it? This is the way that the White House has been talking about the relationship. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, did speak to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman a couple of days ago. But yes, this is a reset. Essentially, the driving force and the power in the kingdom is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He effectively runs the country day to day. His father, the king, put him in that position and has confidence in him, it appears, to make the changes that the kingdom requires, and this is what the Crown Prince wants to do. However, the human rights record in Saudi Arabia is checkered, to say the least, and MBS's role, as the CIA has said in its best estimation, in authorizing the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, is a very damning indictment of him. Now, what came out of that phone conversation was a commitment to a more transparent relationship, and President Biden, although we don't know if this report was actually mentioned in the conversation, did say that he praised the kingdom for its steps towards improving human rights with the release of activists recently from jail. But I think the underlying message is very clear here. If there is more meat on the bones, a smoking gun that implicates Mohammed bin Salman in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, that's going to put tension in the relationship. But everything we know about this report so far is there won't be a smoking gun. That's what we know so far.
And we'll wait and see, I guess. We'll take you. We'll come out, I guess, sometime next Friday, I guess, is the expectation. Nick, thank you. Nick Robertson in London.